I'm joined in the studio by Dan Perry, international affairs analyst and the former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press. Dan, thanks so much for coming in. Dan, a tweet by the President of the United States says that the United States doesn't want war. Iran says they don't want war. So what's happening here?
Well, both of them can't be right. Iran doesn't want to be implicated in the war that it, in fact, carries out through proxies. And the question is whether the world has the ability and the willingness to call that bluff. The Americans are calibrating between their two needs, one to deliver a message that is effective and the other to not cause a massive escalation that they genuinely don't want. The thing about Israel's war in Gaza, by the way, that Israel no longer is calibrating. October 7th changed many things, including the notion of avoiding catastrophe. Israel's willing to risk catastrophe in order to achieve its goals. I don't think America is quite yet, after the deaths of 3 soldiers in Jordan, which it blames on Iran. But what this clearly is the potential for escalation. I would take Iranian denials not at face value. I would say that their protestations of innocence have, it's a question of implausible deniability.
And that's the case. So let's talk about the fact that the Iraqis have asked the chargé d'affaires, the American chargé d'affaires, to come in, but meanwhile they were told in advance that this was going to happen.
Iraq is not occupied by Iran, but it's very much under the influence of Iran. It's a Shiite government. They allow Shiite militias to run riot. They don't have control over a third of their country. I mean, whatever Iraq says basically is always with a view to not upsetting Iran, and with the need of the Shiite-led government to be aligned with Iran. It's a little bit rich to hear Iran talking about the sovereignty of Syria and Iraq, when, I mean, good Lord, their interference around the entire region from Yemen to Lebanon is legion, shameless, and sadly effective.
But there's also, let's go back to the United States for a moment, because there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of screaming from the Republicans, both in the Senate Armed Services Committee, in Congress, from the Republicans, saying 2 things. One, too late. It should have been done long ago, and then also you're not doing enough. There's one senator from Mississippi who basically said what you're giving the Iranians is more of a slap on the wrist than not a punch in the nose.
I think that's undeniable. The hope on the administration side is that the slap in the wrist will somehow suffice, both to mollify the demands in the U.S. for some kind of response, and to cause the Iranians to step back a little bit. I have doubt whether that will be effective, frankly. But I have sympathy also for the reluctance to engage in full-scale and direct war with Iran.
But there's also this notion that maybe the best way for the Americans to handle it is much the way that the Trump administration did back a few years back, where they did surgical strikes. They killed Soleimani just as a one-drop bomb and then walked away, as opposed to a bombing of many different areas far away, not even on Iranian territory.
The assassination of Soleimani certainly was a high point in America's war against Iranian malfeasance in the region. But was it effective? Has Iran really been deterred? So far, I think it's reasonable to conclude that the only thing that will genuinely change the equation in the Middle East is the collapse of the Islamic Republic.
But that's the only way to do that is by force.
Or by true diplomatic and commercial and financial and strategic isolation. For that, the U.S. would have to organize a coalition that would include India and China and make it impossible for Iran to function. And of course, whenever you do such a thing, you face the reasonable criticism that, you know, you're impoverishing the population, and the government, which is not a bunch of good Samaritans, doesn't really care, because it rules by force anyway. But, you know, it is in the nature of dictatorial regimes that they seem invulnerable until they collapse in a very big noise, and the day after no one admits to ever having supported them.
So that's one of the reasons why there's some in Congress in the U.S. who are basically saying sanctions on the oil industry is the way to go. Sanctions on business is the way to go, as opposed to military strike.
Sure, but in the past, sanctions didn't work because they weren't airtight, partly because of China. So you can't make war with everyone and have a coalition that's effective. If the U.S. wants to take on Iran, they have to do more to find a modus vivendi with China And of course, that has its own challenges. That could involve sacrificing Taiwan. It's a very messy landscape in the world in 2024.
I didn't think I'd have to ever quote Niall Ferguson, but I'm going to quote Niall Ferguson because he says that we are living in a pre-war era right now, not a post-war era right now. He's of the notion that the only way to have peace is through arms, through war.
That's his notion. I didn't think I'd ever quote Samuel Huntington, but I fear that it looks like we are indeed in a clash of civilizations as well.
We are,
or the run-up to it.
So the idea that that Biden is sort of this Neville Chamberlain idea of like we're just appeasing Iran just to make sure that we don't want to have a war, we don't want to have a war. Whatever we do, we don't want war, and this is the way to do it.
Let me just say one thing about Chamberlain, who gets a lot of bad press. The actual acquiescence came from his predecessors. Yeah, he wasn't. He was not the only force behind the Munich Agreement. He was trying to fix something created by predecessors. When it comes to Iran, when it comes to the many things about the Middle East that basically need a complete revision, reboot, rethink, it's not Biden, and it isn't even Trump. I fear that we got it wrong in the Middle East for the past 80 years or so.
While we're talking about Biden, it's election season in America, and an increasing proportion of American adults believe that Israel's military response in Gaza has gone too far. That was part of the quote in the poll. And that's a poll that was conducted by Associated Press. It came out yesterday. The polling that came out basically showed that most Americans, 1 out of 2 Americans, feels that what the American administration is doing is not right with Israel. That what Israel is doing is not right.
Well, yes, but that goes in both directions. Some feel he's not supporting Israel enough, Biden. Others more, I think, feel the opposite. The U.S., like most countries, is split on the question of the Gaza war. Indeed, Israel itself is split about whether to prioritize hostages and do a deal now, perhaps leaving Hamas in power in parts of Gaza, or vice versa. But Biden's problem is that in the swing states that he needs to carry, the margin last time was a few tens of thousands of votes. He can't lose any votes. And he needs both the opponents of the war in his coalition, which are the minorities, the Muslims, and the youth, and those who want to see continued support for Israel, which is the Jews. So this has split his coalition in the Democratic Party in a way that could easily cause Trump to return to power. Clearly a problem, not just for Biden, but whoever feels like that would be a global calamity. And there's a lot of people in that camp as well.
But there's an issue also in terms of Israel's PR. And this is the point. Last night there were thousands of demonstrators out front of Columbia University. 9 people were arrested. It doesn't seem like the American government is able to, or because they feel like the youth have bought into the idea that Israel has done wrong.
Yeah, and the main problem indeed is the youth. Other polls showed that Biden's what was a 10-point advantage for Biden in July with the youth of the U.S. registered voters turned into a 6-point deficit. That's a 16-point swing among a key demographic that will only get larger as the years go by. Huge problem for Biden. The PR problem is dual. One, the 18 to 24 demographic really is distinct from everyone else, including the millennials who are only slightly older. Every indication shows their tremendous skepticism about, well, democracy even, capitalism, liberalism, which includes free thought and expression, and a near total buy-in to the narrative of a clash between the developed world and the global South, a need to make amends, a dislike of Western civilization to the point where the very idea is ridiculed. And Israel slots into that. It's seen as a Western outpost in something approaching the global South. And with the youth, that is a really tough slog that a lot of smart people are going to have to think about in coming years. The other PR problem attaches to Israel's own actions in a broader sense. Because of what Israel does in the West Bank, because of the perceptions about the right-wing government of Israel, even reasonable people find themselves being skeptical about Israel's motivations and actions, even as they support the goal in Gaza, which is the removal of a genuinely violent genocidal terrorist group that has taken hostage not just a couple of hundred people in Israel, but 2.5 million Palestinians.
But what is Israel supposed to do? Say, okay, what we'll do is we'll build a wall, a complete wall, and we'll shut everyone out. We'll repatriate the 50,000 Israelis that are there. I mean, is that going to change minds?
500,000.
500,000.
So
sorry.
If you want, we can certainly talk about a reasonable way to reboot the Middle East. October 7th, while it changed a lot of things, didn't change the essence, which is Israel plus the West Bank plus Gaza. is less than half Jewish. And if Israel wishes to be a Jewish state, then it must partition. The problem is that these areas are also too close to Israeli population centers. There's too much hostility among Palestinians. They have been in the thrall of their radical elements. They've allowed militias to flower, and the result is a genuine danger on the security front. So the question is, for Israel, how do you square the circle? I'm afraid the Israelis have gotten used to their security drug, which is the occupation, but that drug is also killing them in the long term. So absolutely, there needs to be a partition. It can't be overnight because of the security problem, but it isn't 500,000 settlers that need to be moved. If you make the security fence line the future border, then only about 80,000 settlers are deep inside. And that is a problem that can probably be resolved. By the way, so many things need to change. There are not 5 million Palestinian refugees. They're descendants of refugees. That problem is fixable. Israel certainly has to insist on an educational system in Palestine that doesn't educate the youth to jihad. Israel also has to accept that it cannot settle lands with Jews and towns for Jews only, that it hasn't annexed and doesn't really claim. So many things have to change in this region, but primarily, I think, the militias have to go. A future Palestine will need to be demilitarized and cannot possibly have Islamic Jihad and Hamas militias. Same in Lebanon with Hezbollah, by the way.
Dan Perry, always a pleasure to have you come in with your insight. Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst and former Middle East editor for the AP. Thank you again.